So then, what is consciousness? In the modern philosophy of mind, consciousness is usually regarded as the ability to have any experience or feeling, what the American philosopher Thomas Nagel called something it is like to be in his famous 1974 paper, which was entitled What is it like to be a bat? If there is something, someone, or anything it is like to have an experience in and of itself, then one is said to be conscious. We won't reject this characterization of consciousness, but will differentiate and try to avoid dangerous conceptual conflations that might follow from it. In fact, we already hinted at the nature of consciousness by contrasting it with the mind, that is, thought processes. If we step back again and position ourselves internally as pure witnesses who observe their thoughts coming and going without any attempt or desire to intervene, we can become aware that there are images, representations, so to speak, a film, playing on an internal background, a screen of consciousness. This witnessing screen is not the thought it witnesses, just as a cinema screen is not the projector's light that shines a sequence of images making up the movie. Consciousness becomes aware of thoughts and the innumerable mental representations that the mind constructs. But it is not these intellectual figments. Because thoughts change, come and go continuously, though in the background there is an immutable observer that does not change. Only this simple internal experiential subjective acknowledgement, which does not need philosophies, complicated logical reasonings, or neuroscientific data, should make it clear how the mind and consciousness must obviously be two distinct entities. Consciousness does not need to think, nor even perceive, either in the mental or sensory way. While the mind is a function, consciousness does not function, it simply is. We may also point out how it is a well-known fact that through meditation techniques one can diminish the flux of thoughts and images in one's own mind. Advanced practitioners also claim to be able to completely stop the mind, that is, the thought processes, and report states of consciousness, of pure awareness and self-existence without any mental content. Meditative conscious states of free awareness, that is, free of any phenomenal content, excluding external sensory stimuli and internal mentation from conscious experience, are described in several contemplative traditions, and in rare instances have even been investigated by modern science through EEG and brain scan technologies. So the description of such deep meditative states, of a bare state of selfless and objectless awareness, may vary from culture to culture as well as among times and personalities. However, they all agree that contrary to what the mind would like us to believe, conscious awareness is heightened and not diminished by the lack of mental content. The less the mind intervenes, the more something else shines through. One directly and clearly self-experiences something distinct from the mind that transcends it. That is consciousness. These facts and realities can become clear and almost self-evident only through an introspective first-person investigation. The physicalist dismisses the first-person view because the third-person approach so successfully in fact described our external reality through science, and thus the physicalist assumes that it will be equally successful in describing also our internal experiential reality. However, that can't work, not even in principle, because the conceptual entities through which we describe the external reality are already internal symbols in our, so to speak, screen of consciousness. It is an attempt to reconstruct our inner reality with these very same inner projections and figments. The abstract third-person perspective is unaware that it is already trying to reduce consciousness to consciousness' own abstractions. We will take up this later in much more detail. Meanwhile, what is essential at this point is to avoid creating a sort of potpourri of mind and consciousness, justifying this conflation with a supposedly scientific attitude that refrains from multiplication of entities or for the principles of parsimony or whatever, but then fails to recognize the existence of two very concrete and distinct entities, if we might label them as such entities. A closer introspection reveals to us that these are ontologically different realities as a matter of experiential fact. Mind and consciousness are two different categories. The failure to recognize this does not come about because of a logical fallacy, but instead happens because we are misguided by our own superficial awareness of things. This typical tendency to reach for the melting pot arises due to the fact that humans do not know themselves. We are mentalized being. We are based in our mind, in our rational faculty, mentalized being, and think in terms of the formations of the mind. We do not even realize that it is possible to see, so to speak, beyond these things, beyond these formations of the mind. However, when we step back from the superficial appearances of our mentalized perceptions, which misinterpret the things as they appear to us at a first glance, for the objective and ultimate truth, if we step back from this way of seeing, then we can avoid this fundamental category mistake. At the end of the story, we intimately know it. There is a subject in us that does not change despite all the thoughts and external happenings. Consciousness is a separate power or force from the mind because the mind is almost always restless, while consciousness is silence, or silent and is silence. Through our inner introspection, we can become aware of something that is a witness. It is in itself being, existence, and self-aware. There is something prior to mental events. Consciousness can be aware of mental content, but is not that mental excitation. It may identify with the mind, but is not that with which it identifies. In us, it is a prior, unmovable witness to the mutable mental ripples, but it is not these ripples, just as the ocean is not its waves. It is a blank page of beingness, the testimony of the mental and other qualitative phenomena that it can apprehend. Therefore, consciousness cannot be defined by words, like we can define a unit of length that measures external physical objects, or as something that we can posit as an axiom. Consciousness is an internal, self-existent and self-explanatory entity. If here we are questioning consciousness, this is only because of our lost ability to introspect. Physicalists are afraid to introspect because they believe it means losing their minds. It is like recognizing ourselves in a mirror image, and humans can do that, by the way, quite well, together with a few other animals. However, animals are able to recognize themselves in a mirror only if they don't panic. The other animals that don't recognize themselves panic and will have to create a fiction. It is the same with us, with our introspection. If we do not want to recognize ourselves, our inner essence, we must create the physicalist fiction. Therefore, we can loosely try to characterize consciousness with words in order to converge on the understanding that avoids confusion when we use the word consciousness. But it should not be taken as a unique and universal definition. So, the primary aspect of consciousness as its beingness, existence, or quality of self-awareness might be the foundation. So we can say that consciousness is an inherent witnessing sense of existence, presence, and sentience, the knower who knows oneself, a self-existent reality, pure self-aware beingness, aware of phenomenal contents, which, however, does not necessitate an object of which to be aware. It exists before any mental, emotional or physical perceptions. It is that in which all experience appears and is known as pure and undifferentiated, irreducible awareness and sense of existence, which witnesses phenomena but remains unaffected by it. It is a changeless, silent, spaceless, featureless, and immobile reality that stands as a pure and undisturbed background behind all our activities. If you look at them with the mind only, these sorts of qualitative characterizations of something in us result in confusing, recursive, and eventually also self-contradictory descriptions, inevitably. However, they become obvious, self-explanatory, and self-evident if you can step back and simply experience, be, witness, observe, and introspect without resorting to conceptualizations. We can resort, however, to metaphors, for example, to the analogy of the cinema screen and the projected light on the very same screen. As the blank screen does not need the movie to exist, so does pure consciousness not need the contents of experiences to exist. However, the fact is that this pure consciousness, this pure self-awareness and self-existent beingness in us, is not just there experiencing nothing. Consciousness is also conscious of something. The film of life, the movie of thoughts, the impressions of emotions, and so on. Our consciousness is sentience and has perceptions of phenomena and events of which it becomes aware. This is, however, not a quantitative experience, but rather an exquisitely qualitative experience. Consciousness allows for a subjective, qualitative experience of phenomenal content. such as the feelings of pain and pleasure, the perceptions of qualities like the redness of a rose, the sweetness of sugar, the lived perception of emotions like love and anger. When Thomas Nagel, the famous American philosopher of mind and of science, asked, "What is it like to be a bat?" he argued that the distinctive character of phenomenal consciousness is that there is something incommunicable that we cannot talk about, and about what it is like for a subject to have that particular experience, namely being a bat. This is something, well, even if you are a bat that could talk in principle, you cannot explain it to another bat. This what it is likeness of experience of being, feeling, knowing, understanding, intending, and so on are distinct experienced qualities proper to any conscious creature. There is something about what it is like for humans to be humans, or for bats to be bats, for me to be me, and for you to be you. This is, unlike stones, mountains, chairs, or an air molecule, for which we at least suppose that nothing is experiencing something or being something. What makes a real difference? Deep down, pure consciousness is the ultimate primitive, the screen on which all impermanent and changing experiences are displayed. However, the sentience of the smell of flowers or the feeling of pain when one puts one's hand in a fire are all qualitative experiences that impress upon consciousness, and they are called qualia. Qualia are phenomenal properties, sensations arising due to a direct experience that goes beyond mere data processing. In our brains, we don't perceive the message, "Oh, this electromagnetic wave has a wavelength of 700 nanometers," as a robot might perceive. As living and sentient beings, we simply perceive a color. The qualia we call, for example, red, or blue, or green, or whatever. If you put your hand into the fire, you don't receive the information, the temperature of this exothermic reaction is 223 degrees Celsius, like a robot or a computer. No, it's something different in us. You simply feel pain. Sentience always has something qualitative to it that can't be reduced to a purely quantitative statement. One must live the experience to know what it is like to be that experience. You can never, ever, not even in principle, know what it feels like to experience qualia only by a quantitative technical description. You must have the experience from a first-person perspective. Qualia are intrinsically first-person observable properties, but not third-person inherent properties of the world. This is what is referred to as phenomenal consciousness. It is the aspect of consciousness capable of experiencing phenomenal properties or qualia. It also goes beyond the five senses. Emotions like anger or happiness, joy or grief, etc., are internal qualitative first-person experiential phenomena that a quantitative intellectual description can't convey to someone else who never had these experiences and wants to know it only by a third-person perspective. That won't never work. Moreover, note that also experiencing a thought is a phenomenon in our minds. The conceptual organization of our experience of the world is also based on phenomenal properties that we perceive and conceive of in terms of space, time, forms, and numbers, or other more or less abstract properties. So, broadly speaking, we can characterize phenomenal consciousness as follows. Phenomenal consciousness is consciousness having subjective experiences and perceptions of experiential properties, qualia. That is, the experience of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and having pains or pleasures. It is the experiencing of consciousness that knows what it is like to have that experience. These subjective qualitative perceptions of phenomena can be of a sensory, physical nature, that is, the experiences arising from the five senses, or that of an inner emotional state, or the apprehension of mental states as concepts, ideas, images, imaginations, etc. So you see, also having ideas, concepts, having a thought is something that is perceived by what? By consciousness. And in that case, we speak of phenomenal consciousness, that is, the consciousness having the experience of a phenomenon. So in the coming lectures, we will elucidate the nature of the whole issue of phenomenal consciousness further. But for the time being, what I would like you to become aware of is the distinction between mind, consciousness, or just pure consciousness, and phenomenal consciousness. The distinction between consciousness and phenomenal consciousness is more of a dynamical character. We might also say that phenomenal consciousness is consciousness that has the experience of something rather than nothing. It is always the same conscious being, but in an intentional state that focuses on and attends to a phenomenon by experiencing it. If you like analogies, consciousness stands to phenomenal consciousness like an ocean with and without waves. But it is always the same ocean. Meanwhile, the distinction between mind and consciousness is of a more fundamental and ontological character. If these concepts are not distinguished and clearly differentiated, there will be significant confusion and misunderstanding and a lot of chaos. I have seen this over and over again. So you have clearly to distinguish between mind and consciousness as we have described above. Now, what about emotions? Are they a state of mind or a state of consciousness? Is an emotion a thought? So the word emotion has its origin in the 16th century French word émouvoir, taken from the Latin emovere, which means to stir up, to move out, or to agitate. In fact, emotions have a strong dynamical component, internally as well externally. Emotions can move us to action, and eventually to psychological and physical violence even, as you know. And one can't deny that there is an intimate relationship between our emotions, mental states, and conscious experience. After all, a thought that recalls a fearful event can trigger in us a sensation of fear. A person's remembrance can induce in us emotions of love or anger, sympathy or antipathy. There is probably never a thought in us that is not more or less subconsciously related to an emotion, or at least to some feeling of attraction or repulsion. Thoughts and emotions are intrinsically intertwined and always go hand in hand. However, this does not imply that they are the same thing. there is a fundamental qualitative experiential difference between an analytic and rational thought process that, for instance, aims to solve, say, a logical mathematical problem, and the sensation of an emotion, like love, hate, anger, fear, joy, or grief. One can think of an emotion, and eventually that can even arouse sensations, but the mind's thought of that emotion is still not the emotion itself. An idea and a mental construct, a conceptual representation or a rational discourse is one thing. An emotion is another. Thoughts are imagined, apprehended, and comprehended, while emotions are felt. It is no coincidence that we speak of reasons clouded by emotions, or equate irrational thinking with emotional thinking, because intimately we know that the nature of reason and the intellect is not that of an emotional process, though we might have a hard time keeping the two separate. It is no coincidence that we highly rate a rational and analytical theory that tries to be detached from emotional impulses, as we intuitively know, that the former works best when the latter are distinguished and set aside. If we separate reason from emotions, then reason works best. We know that. So we know that they are not the same thing. Therefore, a thought is not an emotion, and an emotion is not a thought. They are two distinct and qualitatively very different powers of manifestations in our field of experience. To classify an emotion as a mental state, something unfortunately which is a common practice, is no less absurd like categorizing a thought as an emotional state. Nevertheless, like a thought, an emotion can come and go in front of the witnessing background that does not change, the immutable consciousness. That's what thought and emotions have in common. Again, without having the pretension to systemize by definitions, just to clarify the meaning that should help us avoid falling into fallacies or misunderstanding, we might loosely describe emotions as follows. Emotions are sensations of desire, impulses of passions, sentiments, affections, and instincts of attraction or repulsion. They are an interplay of more or less intense polar perceptions of joy or anger, happiness or sadness, courage or fear, love or hate, etc. Notice where thoughts and emotion are felt in our bodily sensations. We associate the center of our thinking mind in our head, in a particular location between our eyebrows, in the center of our skull. However, emotions express themselves physically elsewhere, in our belly region. When we say you should not think with your belly, we mean precisely that. Misinterpreting our irrational emotions for our rational thoughts leads to an awful confusion and leads us astray. The fact that thoughts and emotions manifest physically in a completely different region of our bodies is also a sign of their very different nature. So, last but not least, where does the body stand in all that? Of course, our bodies are material, made of stuff we call matter. They do not at all have that immaterial and fleeting character of a thought or an emotion, let alone consciousness. Life would become quite complicated if our bodily existence were as impermanent as our thoughts and emotions. But are the properties of permanence and impermanence a conclusive criterion for reality? That's a question we will pursue later in more detail. In any case, we know our bodies not only by an external observation, say our eyes looking at our hands, but also, and even more than that, by an inner perception and feeling of its presence and existence as something that appears in the same field of our conscious awareness, as thought and emotions do. If we close our eyes, we have the experience of the body as a sensation that appears in ourselves within our field of consciousness. Our bodily perceptions, such as taste, sound, sight, touch, and smell, are physical signals that we experience in us. We will go into greater detail in this latter aspect in the following section. The body is not just a clump of matter, but rather serves as the interface, a junction between our inner and outer worlds. So please notice that we didn't reach this conclusion simply by some abstract reasoning, or because we wanted to save appearances or due to preferences aimed at preserving some ideological belief system. I invited you to go inward and check the facts experientially by a method of self-inquiry and an experiential investigation that looks at what things are and how they present themselves in ourselves beyond mental constructs. We identified mind, consciousness, and emotions as interrelated and interconnected, but ontologically different entities by an internally oriented empiric observation, so to speak. We could confirm the separate function and existence of the mind, consciousness, and emotions as a matter of fact, just as one can distinguish between two colors or tastes, or between the sounds of two musical instruments. So it is in this spirit and logic that we will proceed. What is essential is that we position ourselves by the truth, not by some easy, shortcut intellectual construct that, in the end, wants only to please one or the other belief system. In particular, Western philosophy did not distinguish or discriminate between very different ontological entities such as the mind and consciousness. It is time to recognize that this is a category mistake and begin to look further